This video is going to introduce the basic interactive steps of creating customizable files, which is step 3 for creating templates, as we've said. If you look at add needed files, you see an iterative loop that we showed before where we generate code and then we find any discrepancies between the sample and code and we resolve them until we get to a point where our code that we're generating is identical with the code contained in sample. At that point, we will not only have an effective template, but we will have converted our own code to be usable with that template by using code instead of our sample that we based it on. What I want to do in this video is show you how the cycle works and show you how to classify files that need to be generated. Let's look again the diffs from the last time that we ran this. First, you have to understand that this file contains 3 types of results. One is files that there are 2 versions, they differ. The second, files that are being generated in code but not contained in sample. And the third are files not generated. The majority of the time goes into the files not being generated. You have to understand how to deal with all 3. So in general, whether you have a new file entirely or whether you have a differing file where the contents are all on one side or the other, either they are all being produced in code but not in sample, or all in sample but not in code, then you follow the instructions on the sides of this chart to show what you have to do. If they are partly in both, then you clearly have to change the template until, again, you can apply 1 or 2 of these. Let's start by looking at the files that are being added only to code, new added, and not being contained in sample. So you see we have meta and custom. What we need to do first is look here. Now these are only on the side of code, right? And I want to just get used to this process. So it's only on the side of code. So we have to ask, do these belong in all the code? I'm talking about meta and source custom. And the answer is absolutely. By the way, if you want to know where source custom comes from, in our config, we specify that the custom directory is source custom. That's why source custom is being generated here by NSFlip. So what we need to do is, if it belongs in all the code, then we simply copy it over to sample. Let's set file to meta, and let's create a generic copy very close to this. We'll copy recursively the file to sample file, and of course we don't need any of this, the redirection. So that's our basic copy command. Let's set file is equal to source custom, and let's do the same thing here. Now we can do step 2 of this basic iteration. So let's go back to our big diff, and then we should be able to view the changes. Okay, for some reason, I'm not sure why, we had a problem with originally copying over custom. If we look here now, we can see files have changed on disk and now they are gone. I simply copied it a second time. We've gotten rid of all of one of the 3 categories. Now let's start looking at the differences in the files. We looked at package.json. In fact, this is the package.json differences. We're not so concerned about that. One thing that we can do is remove package.json from the list of files that we're diffing on. For the record, NSFlip does not, in fact, pay any attention to package.json, except to give you an update to it if there are updates to a package that you have. So package.json is actually automatically excluded. And we also aren't going to look at package.lock.json. That's going to have stuff that's not relevant to us. So what I want to do now is go back with our modified diff. Now let's look, and we see now that we've got the files down to 2. So what we want to do now, before we finish this video, let's look at a file and actually classify it as terms of types of files. From here on out, the expectation is that we're going to be working on, having gotten rid of the extra things that we're generating and put them in already. Now we're going to start dealing with actual issues of what we have to create. So what I want to do is, let's look at ESLint-RC. Let's just see what difference is that we're talking about here. So let's look at the diff. Okay, it says here that there are basically some rules being added here. These rules are customized rules that are relevant to the person who created the particular example, the sample that we're using. So it could be that the next person will want to have different rules. So this is an example of something that's going to require some customization in our template. So how do we go about adding a file to deal with customization? The first thing we have to do is classify the file. What I wanted to talk about here. If you look in classifying files, you see this flowchart that shows you pretty simply how you analyze that problem. What it really comes down to is who knows whether you're going to need this file everywhere, or who knows how many of this file you're going to have. Basically, standard is something that the file appears in every single customized code base that comes out of the template. What that means is that the template developer themselves knows already how many there's going to be of a certain type of file. If so, then it's certainly not static or dynamic. It's standard. It could be that it's not relevant at all. There are files we will find that aren't relevant at all. And if they're not relevant to customization, we probably do not need it. If a template is not going to be generating it, then of course it's not relevant, and we can remove it from our diff and ignore it. Then what happens if there is going to be a number of these, but it's not going to be known until it's at runtime because it's being produced by a call to a server dynamically? In that case, it's dynamic. The basic rule is if the code-based developer knows how many there are, it's static. Like, for instance, we're creating CLIs here. So a CLI is going to have a number of, and that number is going to be set for any given code base at any given time, so that's static. Whereas if you modify the CLI to contain some call to a server for some reason, that's probably going to be a dynamic component that you're talking about, so that's going to be a dynamic file. So which one is ESLintRC? It's not static because we know how many there are. We know as a template developer how many there are, so that means it's standard. So our next job, and in our next video we're going to do it, is to create our first customized file.